Evelyn Harper had always known the land would shape her fate, but nothing in her past could have prepared her for the day the wind changed and the world she knew began to unravel. The western sky was the color of old bruises, and the air carried the sharp, metallic promise of snow. She stood at the edge of the only road leading out of her former life, her hands trembling beneath the thin wool of her shawl, her belly heavy with the child she would soon bring into a world that had already proven itself unkind. The prairie stretched in every direction, a vast, indifferent sea of frost-bitten grass and stunted pines, broken only by the distant silhouette of Red Willow, a town so small it barely warranted a name, let alone a future. Evelyn's boots, cracked and dusted with the remnants of a dozen roads, pressed into the frozen mud as she waited for her children to catch up. Lila, her eldest, moved with a quiet determination that belied her 8 years, her eyes scanning the horizon for threats or hope, whichever might come first. Sam, just 5, clung to his mother's skirt, his silence a language of its own, learned in the long, hard months since the world had changed. They had left the only home they had ever known in the wake of violence that still echoed in Evelyn's bones. Her husband, Thomas, had fallen in a dispute over land one moment a man, the next a memory, his blood soaking into the earth he had tried so hard to claim. The law had come and gone, leaving behind nothing but questions and the cold comfort of indifference. Neighbors who once shared bread and laughter now averted their eyes, whispering about the dangers of a woman alone, about the curse that seemed to follow the Harpers. The preacher's words had been the final blow, delivered with the certainty of a man who had never known hunger or fear. It's not proper for a widow to keep land that's no longer hers. Best you move on, Miss Harper, before the frost sets in. So she had gathered what little she could carry, bundled her children against the coming winter, and set out toward the unknown. The journey had been harder than she'd imagined. Rides were scarce, and those willing to offer them often expected more than gratitude in return. She learned to keep her head down, to accept kindness with suspicion, to sleep with one eye open and a hand on the knife she kept hidden in her skirts. Each mile put more distance between her and the life she had lost, but the weight of grief and uncertainty never lessened. By the time they reached Red Willow, Evelyn's hope was as thin as the shawl around her shoulders. The town was little more than a scattering of buildings huddled against the wind, a church with a steeple that leaned like a drunkard, a saloon whose windows glowed with the promise of warmth and danger, a general store with a faded sign and a porch sagging under the weight of years. The people who passed her on the street did so quickly, their faces shuttered, their eyes sliding away from the sight of a pregnant woman with 2 children and nowhere to go. Evelyn felt the cold settle into her bones as she stood in the center of town, uncertain of her next step. She could not go back, and she saw no path forward. Lila's hand found hers, small and cold, and for a moment Evelyn allowed herself to lean into the touch, to draw strength from the child who had already endured too much. It was then that she noticed the paper nailed to the post outside the general store, its edges fluttering in the wind. The words were simple, written in a hand that spoke of both desperation and pride. Man for hire. Will work for shelter through the winter. $1. No questions asked. She read it twice, her mind struggling to make sense of the offer. It was not charity, nor was it the kind of arrangement that would draw the attention of the law. It was, perhaps, the only chance she had left Evelyn hesitated, her heart pounding with a mixture of fear and resolve. She had learned to be wary of men, especially those who offered help for a price. But the memory of Thomas's death, the preacher's cold eyes, and the endless, hungry road behind her left her with little choice. She pressed her last dollar into her palm, feeling the rough edge of the coin bite into her skin, and turned to her children. "We're going to meet someone," she said quietly, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. Leela nodded, her face set in a mask of determination, while Sam simply stared at the ground, his small fingers twisting the hem of his coat. The man who waited at the edge of town was not what Evelyn expected. He stood apart from the others, his back to the wind, his coat patched and worn but clean. His hair was dark, his beard thick, and his eyes, when he finally looked at her, were the color of storm clouds gathering over the plains. There was a stillness to him, a sense of patience honed by years of watching and waiting. He did not smile, nor did he offer any greeting beyond a single measured nod. Evelyn studied him, searching for signs of danger or deceit, but found only a quiet resignation that mirrored her own. She held out the dollar, her hand steady, and watched as he took it without hesitation. His fingers were rough, the nails clean but scarred, and for a moment she wondered what kind of life had shaped a man like this. "What's your name?" she asked, her voice barely more than a whisper. He considered her for a long moment, his gaze flickering to the children and then back to her. "Jonas Blackwell," he said, his voice low and even, carrying the weight of a man who had learned to keep his secrets close. The name meant nothing to her, but the way he said it made her shiver. She nodded, unsure of what else to say, and together they gathered her meager belongings, 2 battered suitcases, a bundle of blankets, a tin of bread and dried apples. Jonas led the way to a small wagon hitched to a tired-looking mule, his movements efficient and silent. Lila climbed in first, pulling Sam after her, while Evelyn settled herself on the rough wooden seat, her body aching with exhaustion and the strain of carrying new life. They left Red Willow as the sun dipped below the horizon, the sky streaked with the last, desperate light of day. The road wound through stands of bare cottonwoods and over frozen creeks, the silence between them broken only by the creak of the wagon and the distant call of a lone coyote. Evelyn watched the land slip past, her thoughts a tangled knot of fear, hope, and the relentless need to survive. The cabin appeared out of the darkness like a secret, its roof bowed under the weight of snow, its windows glowing with the faint promise of warmth. Jonas helped her down from the wagon, his hands careful and impersonal, and led the children inside. The air was thick with the scent of wood smoke and stew, the fire burning low in the hearth. There was a cot for her, a pallet for the children, and shelves lined with jars of beans and preserves. Jonas moved through the space with the quiet assurance of someone who had lived alone for a long time, his presence both comforting and unsettling. That first night, Evelyn lay awake long after the children had fallen asleep, listening to the wind rattle the windows and the steady rhythm of Jonas's footsteps as he checked the doors and banked the fire. She wondered what kind of man would offer himself for $1, what secrets he carried in the lines of his face and the silence of his movements. In the morning, the snow had come, blanketing the world in white and muting the sounds of the forest. Jonas was already outside, splitting wood with a steady, practiced rhythm. Evelyn watched him from the doorway, her shawl pulled tight, her breath clouding in the air. He did not look up, but she felt his awareness, the way he seemed to know she was there without turning. Lila and Sam explored the cabin, their voices soft, their laughter tentative. For the first time in weeks, Evelyn allowed herself to hope that they might survive the winter. She set about making breakfast, her hands moving by memory, and when Jonas came in, he accepted the bowl of porridge without a word. They ate in silence, the only sound the crackle of the fire and the wind against the walls. It was not comfort, not yet, but it was a beginning. That afternoon, as the snow fell heavier, Jonas repaired a broken shutter while Evelyn mended a torn blanket. The children played quietly, building towers from firewood and whispering secrets. The cabin felt less like a shelter and more like a home, though Evelyn would not have dared to say it aloud. As dusk settled, Jonas paused in his work and looked at Evelyn, his gaze steady. "You're Harper, aren't you?" he said, and the way he spoke her name made her heart stutter. She stared at him, fear and recognition warring in her chest. "How do you know that?" she whispered. Jonas did not answer right away. He set down his hammer, wiped his hands on his coat, and met her eyes. "Because you prayed for help once," he said quietly, "and I heard you." The words hung at the air, heavy with meaning Evelyn could not yet grasp. Outside, the snow continued to fall, erasing the world beyond the cabin, and inside, something old and unspoken began to stir. Evelyn Harper woke to the sound of wind scraping against the cabin walls, the kind of sound that made a person grateful for shelter, no matter how humble. The world outside was a blur of white and gray, the snow piling higher each day, erasing the path that had brought her here. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of wood smoke and the faint sweetness of dried apples simmering on the stove. She lay still for a moment, listening to the slow, even breathing of her children curled beside her, and the distant, measured footsteps of Jonas Blackwell as he moved about the cabin. The first days in the mountains passed in a haze of exhaustion and uncertainty. Evelyn found herself watching Jonas with a mixture of gratitude and suspicion, never quite sure what to make of the man who had accepted $1 and, in return, offered them a chance at survival. He spoke little, his words clipped and careful, but his actions were steady and precise. He chopped wood before dawn, kept the fire burning, and made repairs to the cabin with a quiet competence that suggested he had done this for years. When he was outside, she would sometimes catch him scanning the tree line. His eyes narrowed as if searching for something only he could see. Lila and Sam, still wary, kept close to their mother. Lila, always the braver of the two, ventured to help Jonas stack firewood or fetch water from the creek, but she did so with a watchful eye, her small hands never straying far from a mother's reach. Sam, quieter than ever, spent hours drawing shapes in the frost on the window, his breath fogging the glass as he traced invisible stories. Evelyn tried to settle into a routine, but the unfamiliar rhythms of mountain life left her feeling unmoored. She cooked what little they had, rationing beans and flour, stretching every meal as far as it would go. She mended clothes by the firelight, her fingers stiff with cold, and swept the floor each morning, as if the simple act of cleaning could keep the darkness at bay. At night, when the wind howled and the cabin creaked, she lay awake, listening to the sounds of Jonas moving quietly through the rooms, always vigilant. It was during one of these long nights that Evelyn's thoughts began to drift back to the past, to a time before grief and hunger had become her constant companions. She remembered a night years ago, a fire in the distance, the smell of smoke and fear, and a stranger's voice calling her name. The memory was hazy, half-formed, but it lingered at the edges of her mind, refusing to be dismissed. Jonas, for his part, kept his distance. He slept on a narrow cot near the door, his rifle always within reach. He never asked questions about her life before Red Willow, nor did he offer any details about his own. Yet there were moments, small, fleeting, when Evelyn caught a glimpse of something softer beneath his stoic exterior. Once, she found him kneeling by the hearth, showing Sam how to whittle a piece of wood into the shape of a bird. Another time, she saw him pause at the window, watching Lila as she played in the snow, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. The days grew shorter, the nights colder. One morning, Evelyn woke to find Lila burning with fever, her skin hot and dry, her eyes glassy with pain. Panic rose in Evelyn's chest as she pressed a damp cloth to her daughter's forehead, whispering prayers she no longer believed would be answered. Jonas watched from the doorway, his face unreadable, then turned and began gathering supplies, boots, coat, a battered satchel. "I'll go to town," he said, his voice low but certain. "There's a doctor there, or at least medicine." Evelyn wanted to protest, to tell him it was too dangerous, that the roads were impassable and the townsfolk suspicious of strangers. But the desperation in her daughter's eyes left her with no choice. She nodded, her hands trembling as she handed him the last of their money. Jonas left before dawn, his figure swallowed by the swirling snow. The hours stretched endlessly, each one marked by the sound of Lila's labored breathing and the distant howl of the wind. Evelyn sat by her daughter's side, holding her hand, whispering stories of spring and sunlight, of a world beyond the storm. Sam hovered nearby, his small face pinched with worry, his eyes never leaving his sister. When Jonas finally returned, his coat crusted with ice, he carried a small tin of medicine and a bundle of supplies. He said nothing of the journey, only handed the medicine to Evelyn and set about building up the fire. She watched him move, noting the stiffness in his gait, the fresh bruise blooming along his jaw. She wanted to ask what had happened, but the words caught in her throat. Instead, she focused on caring for Lila, spooning the bitter medicine between her lips, praying for the fever to break. Days passed in a blur of worry and exhaustion. Slowly, Lila's fever faded, her strength returning in fits and starts. Evelyn felt a weight lift from her chest, replaced by a cautious gratitude she did not know how to express. She found herself watching Jonas more closely, searching for signs of the man beneath the silence. She noticed the way he favored his left arm, the scars that crisscrossed his knuckles, the haunted look that sometimes flickered in his eyes when he thought no one was watching. One afternoon, As she was tidying the shelves, Evelyn's hand brushed against something tucked behind a row of jars. She pulled it free. A small, worn locket, its surface etched with a pattern she recognized instantly. It had belonged to her mother, lost years ago in the chaos of a fire that had destroyed their first home. She turned it over in her palm, her heart pounding. How had it come to be here, in this cabin, so far from where she had last seen it? Suspicion flared in her chest, sharp and sudden. She glanced at Jonas, who was mending a broken chair by the hearth, his expression unreadable. For a moment, she wondered if he had been following her, if their meeting in Red Willow had been more than chance. The thought unsettled her, stirring old fears she had tried to bury. That night, after the children were asleep, Evelyn sat by the fire, turning the locket over and over in her hands. Jonas sat across from her, his gaze fixed on the flames. The silence between them was heavy, filled with questions neither dared to ask. Finally, she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. How did you find this? She held out the locket, her hand trembling. Jonas looked at the locket, then at Evelyn. For a long moment, he said nothing. Then, quietly, he began to speak. He told her of a night years ago, of a fire outside a small town, of a young woman he had carried from the burning wreckage. He had found the locket in the ashes, kept it as a reminder of a promise he had made to protect, to atone, to find some measure of redemption in a world that offered little. Evelyn listened, her heart pounding. The memory returned in a rush, the smoke, the fear, the strong arms lifting her to safety. She realized, with a jolt, that Jonas had saved her once before, long before Red Willow, long before the world had turned cold. The revelation changed something between them. The distance that had once seemed insurmountable now felt smaller, bridged by shared pain and the fragile hope of forgiveness. Evelyn found herself trusting Jonas in ways she had not thought possible, allowing herself to believe that, perhaps, they could build something new from the ashes of their old lives. But trust, she knew, was a fragile thing. The world outside remained dangerous, the future uncertain. Yet, as the days passed and the snow continued to fall, Evelyn felt a quiet strength growing within her, a determination to survive, to protect her children, and to find, in this unlikely place, a sense of belonging she had never known before. Jonas, too, seemed changed. He spoke more often, his words still careful but less guarded. He taught Lila how to set snares for rabbits, showed Sam how to carve simple toys from scraps of wood. He shared stories of his own childhood, of a life spent on the run, of mistakes made and lessons learned. Evelyn saw the weight he carried, the guilt that haunted him, but also the kindness that shone through in small, everyday acts. One evening, as they sat together by the fire, Jonas told her the truth of his past. He had been a wanted man, a gunslinger with a price on his head, forced to flee from town to town, always looking over his shoulder. He spoke of violence and regret, of friends lost and promises broken. He did not ask for forgiveness, nor did he expect it. He simply laid his story before her, as if offering a piece of himself he could no longer bear to carry alone. Evelyn listened in silence, her heart aching with understanding. She knew what it was to be hunted by the past, to long for a second chance. She reached across the space between them, her hand resting lightly on his, and in that moment, something unspoken passed between them, a promise, perhaps, or the beginning of one. The winter deepened, the snow piling higher against the cabin walls. Yet inside, a fragile sense of peace began to take root. Evelyn and Jonas, once strangers bound by necessity, now found themselves bound by something more, by shared pain, by hope, by the slow, careful work of building trust. Outside, the wind howled and the world remained unforgiving. But within the walls of the cabin, warmth flickered, fragile but real, a light against the darkness that threatened to consume them all. Evelyn Harper watched the world outside the cabin grow harsher with each passing day. The snow, once a gentle hush over the land, had become a relentless force, piling high against the windows and burying the path to the creek. The wind howled through the trees, rattling the shutters and seeping cold into every crack. Inside, the fire burned low, and the shelves grew barer with each meal. The winter was not just a season here, it was a test, and every day felt like a question with no certain answer. Jonas Blackwell moved through these days with a quiet determination. He rose before dawn, checking the traps he had set along the tree line, returning with a rabbit, or more often, empty-handed. He taught Lila how to read animal tracks in the snow, how to set a snare with steady hands, how to listen for the warning calls of crows. Sam, still small but eager, followed Jonas everywhere, his eyes wide with admiration and the hope of learning something that might help them all survive. Evelyn saw how the children began to trust Jonas, how Layla's laughter returned in brief, bright flashes, how Sam's shyness faded as he learned to whittle a stick or carry an armful of kindling. Yet beneath her relief, a deeper fear lingered. The food stores dwindled, and the world outside seemed to close in tighter each day. She rationed flour and beans, stretched every scrap of meat, and tried to hide her anxiety from the children. At night, when the fire was low and the cabin quiet, she lay awake, listening to the wind and wondering how much longer they could hold out. It was during one of these long, hungry nights that Evelyn first sensed something was wrong. She woke to the sound of footsteps crunching in the snow outside, too heavy and deliberate to be Jonas or the children. She held her breath, straining to hear, but the footsteps faded into the distance. In the morning, she found nothing but a line of tracks leading into the woods, half covered by fresh snow. Jonas examined them in silence, his jaw tight, his eyes shadowed with worry. The next day, Jonas was more cautious. He kept his rifle close, his eyes scanning the tree line whenever he stepped outside. He spoke little, but Evelyn could feel the tension in his movements, the way he paused at the window, watching the woods as if expecting something or someone to emerge. Lila and Sam sensed it too, their play growing quieter, their laughter more subdued. Once, while gathering firewood, Jonas spotted a flicker of movement among the trees, a flash of color, the glint of metal. He returned to the cabin, his face grim, and told Evelyn to keep the children inside. That night, he sat by the door, rifle across his knees, his gaze fixed on the darkness beyond the window. Evelyn's fear deepened. She remembered the stories Jonas had told her, the life he had left behind, the men who might still be searching for him. She wondered if the past had finally caught up to them, if the fragile peace they had built was about to be shattered. The answer came sooner than she expected. One afternoon, as the snow fell in thick, silent sheets, Sam slipped out to gather kindling from the edge of the woods. He was gone only a few minutes before Evelyn realized he had not returned. Panic surged through her as she called his name, her voice swallowed by the wind. Lila ran to the door, her face pale with fear, while Jonas grabbed his coat and rifle, his movements swift and controlled. They searched the woods together, calling for Sam, their voices echoing through the trees. The snow was deep, the cold biting, and Evelyn's heart pounded with every step. She imagined all the dangers that might be lurking: wolves, hidden ravines, the men Jonas feared. But she pushed those thoughts aside, focusing only on the sound of her son's voice, the hope that he was still close. After what felt like hours, they found him huddled beneath a fallen tree, his cheeks red with cold, his eyes wide with fear. He clung to Jonas, sobbing, and Evelyn wrapped her arms around him, relief and guilt mingling in her chest. They returned to the cabin together, the family drawn tighter by the ordeal, their gratitude for each other stronger than ever. That night, as Sam slept curled between his mother and sister, Jonas sat by the fire, his face drawn and thoughtful. Evelyn watched him, sensing the weight he carried, the fear that had settled over them all. She knew he was thinking of the tracks in the snow, the shadows in the woods, the ghosts of his past that refused to stay buried. The next morning brought a new challenge. As Evelyn prepared breakfast, a knock sounded at the door, soft, hesitant, but unmistakable. Jonas moved to answer, his rifle in hand, while Evelyn gathered the children behind her. When he opened the door, a woman stood on the threshold, her face gaunt with hunger, a small child clinging to her skirts. Snow clung to their clothes, and desperation shone in the woman's eyes. She asked for shelter, her voice barely more than a whisper. Evelyn hesitated, torn between compassion and fear. She remembered her own journey, the kindness she had received, the dangers she had faced. Jonas watched her, waiting for her decision. After a moment, Evelyn nodded, stepping aside to let the woman and her child inside. The cabin grew more crowded, the air thick with tension and uncertainty. The woman, whose name was Ruth, spoke little of her past, but Evelyn recognized the signs of hardship, the hollow cheeks, the wary glances, the way she kept her child close. Sam and Lila watched the newcomers with curiosity and caution, their own fears reflected in the stranger's eyes. Despite the strain on their resources, Evelyn shared what little they had. She found herself drawn to Ruth, their shared experiences forging a quiet bond. They worked together to stretch the food, to keep the children warm, to maintain a sense of normalcy in a world that seemed determined to take everything from them. But the sense of safety was fragile. Jonas remained on edge, his vigilance never wavering. He spoke to Evelyn in hushed tones, warning her to be careful, to trust no one too quickly. She understood his caution, but she also saw the toll it took on him, the sleepless nights, the haunted look in his eyes, the way he flinched at every unexpected sound. The tension reached its peak one evening when Jonas spotted movement at the edge of the clearing. He recognized the figure's men from his past, their faces hard and familiar, their intentions unmistakable. Among them was a man Jonas had once called a friend, now an enemy, and another whose presence sent a chill through Evelyn's heart, the man who had played a part in her husband's death. Jonas knew there would be no more running. He told Evelyn the truth, his voice steady but heavy with regret. The men outside were looking for him, seeking revenge for old betrayals and debts unpaid. He could leave, try to draw them away, but he would not abandon the family he had come to love. For the first time, Jonas chose to stand his ground, to face the ghosts of his past, rather than let them destroy the life he had found. Evelyn felt fear, but also a fierce determination. She would not let the past steal her future or the future of her children. Together, she and Jonas prepared for what might come, their bond forged in hardship and hope. Ruth, too, stood with them, her own courage rising in the face of danger. As night fell, the cabin was filled with a tense, expectant silence. Outside, the wind howled and the shadows gathered at the edge of the woods. Inside, the family and their new companions waited, united by the trials they had faced and the promise that, whatever happened, they would face it together. In that moment, Evelyn understood that survival was not just a matter of food or shelter, but of trust, of loyalty, of the willingness to fight for those you love. The winter still raged outside, and the dangers were real. But within the walls of the cabin, something stronger than fear began to take root, a sense of belonging, of purpose, of hope that even the harshest season could not extinguish. Ta Nuban muon tui tieptuk voifan for hoa kan chinsua sauhon, heifan hoi. Evelyn Harper barely slept the night the storm returned. The wind battered the cabin, howling through the trees and driving snow against the windows until the glass rattled in its frame. Inside, the fire burned low, its light flickering over the faces of those gathered close. Ruth sat near the hearth, her child pressed to her side, while Lila and Sam huddled together beneath a quilt, their eyes wide and anxious. Jonas Blackwell moved quietly from window to door, checking the locks, his rifle always within reach. The tension in the air was as sharp as the cold outside, and Evelyn felt it in every muscle, every breath. She had sensed this moment coming for days, ever since Jonas had spotted tracks in the snow and shadows moving at the edge of the woods. The men who haunted Jonas's past and her own were drawing closer, their presence a dark weight pressing in on the fragile peace they had built. Now, as the storm raged and the world outside disappeared into a blur of white, Evelyn knew the time for running had ended. The first shot came just after midnight, shattering the silence in the window above the table. Glass exploded inward, scattering across the floor. Jonas reacted instantly, pulling Leila and Sam behind the heavy table, his body a shield between them and the danger outside. Evelyn's heart hammered as she reached for the shotgun Jonas had shown her how to use, her hands trembling but determined. Ruth clutched her child, her face pale but resolute. Outside, voices rose above the wind, rough, angry, demanding. The men Jonas had once called brothers had come for him, and they would not leave without blood. The attack came in waves, shadows darting past the windows, bullets thudding into the walls, the door shuddering beneath heavy boots. Jonas fired through the broken glass, his aim steady even as blood blossomed on his arm. Evelyn fought to keep her fear at bay, focusing on the children, on the feel of the shotgun in her hands. Lila clung to her small body shaking, but her eyes never left her mother's face. In that moment, Evelyn saw something shift in her daughter, a spark of courage, a fierce determination that mirrored her own. When a bullet tore through the door and sent splinters flying, Lila pressed closer, whispering a single word that cut through the chaos. "Mama." It was not a plea, but a promise. Jonas staggered as another shot found its mark, his body slumping against the wall. Evelyn's heart lurched, but there was no time for panic. She dragged him behind the table, pressing a cloth to his wound, her hands slick with blood. Ruth moved to help, her own fear forgotten in the face of necessity. Together, they worked to staunch the bleeding, to keep Jonas conscious, to hold the line against the darkness pressing in from all sides. The men outside shouted threats, their voices muffled by the storm. Evelyn heard her own name, twisted with hatred, and the name of her late husband. Spat like a curse, she felt the old grief rise up, sharp and cold, but she forced it down, focusing on the present, on the lives that depended on her. The fighting dragged on, minutes stretching into hours. The storm raged, snow piling against the door, the wind howling like a wounded animal. Inside, the air grew thick with smoke and fear. Evelyn fired the shotgun when the door buckled, the recoil jarring her shoulder, but she did not falter. She saw one of the attackers fall, heard another curse, and retreat. Lila watched her mother with wide, awestruck eyes, her fear tempered by pride. Jonas drifted in and out of consciousness, his breath ragged, his skin clammy with sweat. Evelyn pressed her hand to his cheek, whispering words of comfort she barely believed. Ruth tended to his wounds as best she could, her hands steady despite the chaos around them. The children huddled together, silent and watchful, their faces pale in the firelight. As dawn approached, the storm began to break. The wind eased, the snow slowed, and the world outside grew quiet. The attackers, battered and bloodied, retreated into the trees, their threats fading into the distance. Evelyn slumped against the wall, exhaustion washing over her in waves. She looked at Jonas, his eyes fluttering open, and felt a surge of relief so powerful it brought tears to her eyes. But the ordeal was not over. As the adrenaline faded, Evelyn felt a sharp pain in her belly, a tightening that stole her breath. She realized, with a jolt of fear and wonder, that the baby was coming. Ruth saw the change in her face and moved quickly, guiding Evelyn to the cot, gathering towels and water. Her own child watching with wide, solemn eyes. The hours that followed blurred into a haze of pain and determination. The children huddled together, silent and watchful, while Ruth coached Evelyn through each contraction, her voice calm and steady. Jonas, too weak to stand, reached for Evelyn's hand, his grip a lifeline in the storm. Lila knelt beside her mother, her small hand stroking Evelyn's hair, her voice a whisper of encouragement. When the baby finally arrived, her cry cut through the silence, sharp and clear. Evelyn wept with relief and joy, cradling her daughter to her chest. the warmth of new life a balm against the wounds of the night. Lila leaned close, her eyes shining with tears, and for the first time, she looked at Jonas and called him Papa, her voice trembling with love and gratitude. Jonas smiled, weak but genuine, his eyes meeting Evelyn's in a moment of understanding that needed no words. Ruth wrapped the baby in a blanket, her own face soft with wonder. Sam crept closer, peering at his new sister, his fear forgotten in the face of this fragile miracle. The cabin, battered and scarred, was filled with a sense of peace that had been hard won. The danger had passed, but the memory of it lingered in every shadow, every scar. Evelyn tended to Jonas's wounds, her hands gentle, her heart full. She saw the pain in his eyes, the fear that he might not recover, but she refused to let it take root. She spoke to him of hope, of the future they could build together, of the family they had become. In the days that followed, Jonas's strength returned slowly. The children took turns caring for him, bringing him water, telling him stories, their voices bright with relief. Ruth stayed on, her gratitude unspoken but clear in every gesture. The bond between them all deepened, forged in the fire of shared struggle and survival. Evelyn found herself changed by the ordeal. She no longer saw herself as a victim of fate, but as a woman who had fought for her family and won. She looked at Jonas, at the children, at the new life in her arms, and understood at last what it meant to belong not just to a place, but to each other. The winter still lingered, the snow deep and unyielding, but inside the cabin, warmth blossomed. The scars of the past remained, but they no longer defined them. Together, they had faced the darkness and emerged into the light, their love and courage a shield against whatever storms might come. As Evelyn watched the sun rise over the mountains, painting the world in gold and pink, she held her daughter close and whispered a promise to protect, to cherish, to never let fear steal what they had fought so hard to find. In the hush that followed, she listened to the soft breathing of her family, the gentle crackle of the fire, and the distant call of a bird welcoming the dawn. The world outside was still cold, still dangerous, but within these walls, hope had taken root. And in that quiet moment, surrounded by those she loved, Evelyn Harper knew she was finally home. Evelyn Harper awoke to the hush of a world transformed. The storm had passed, leaving behind a landscape softened by snow and silence. But inside the cabin, the air was thick with the scent of wood smoke, new life, and the slow, steady rhythm of recovery. The walls still bore the scars of the night they had survived splintered wood. A window patched with canvas, dark stains on the floor that would fade with time. Yet, as sunlight crept across the room, Evelyn felt a quiet hope stirring within her, fragile but persistent. Jonas Blackwell's recovery was slow. Each morning, he pushed himself a little further, rising from his bed to sit by the fire, then to stand at the window, and finally to step outside, leaning heavily on a cane Ruth had fashioned from a sturdy branch. His wounds ached and his strength returned in fits and starts, but his spirit was steadier than ever. He watched the children with a new tenderness, his eyes lingering on the baby in Evelyn's arms, on Lila's careful hands as she swept the hearth, on Sam's eager face as he helped gather kindling. Evelyn moved through her days with a sense of purpose she had not known in years. The baby, whom they named Clara, slept in a basket near the fire, her tiny breaths a reminder of all they had gained and all they had yet to build. Lila took to her new role as big sister with a seriousness that made Evelyn smile, while Sam, emboldened by the trials they had faced, followed Jonas everywhere, his questions endless and his admiration plain. Ruth remained, her decision to stay unspoken but clear in every gesture. She mended clothes, tended the fire, and helped Evelyn with the baby. Her presence a comfort that eased the weight of loneliness, her own child. A boy named Eli grew stronger each day, his laughter returning as he played with Lila and Sam, their games echoing through the cabin and out into the yard. The work of rebuilding began slowly. The men patched the roof and replaced the shattered window, while Evelyn and Ruth scrubbed the floors and aired out the bedding. Lila and Sam gathered stones from the creek to shore up the foundation, their hands red and raw from the cold, but their spirits high. Each task, no matter how small, felt like a step toward reclaiming their lives from the chaos that had threatened to consume them. As the days lengthened and the snow began to melt, the rhythm of life settled into something almost peaceful. Jonas, still limping, took Sam into the woods to teach him how to track rabbits and set snares. The boy listened intently, his eyes wide with wonder, as Jonas pointed out the signs left by deer and foxes, the subtle shifts in the wind that spoke of coming weather. Lila, meanwhile, helped Evelyn and Ruth turn the earth in the small garden behind the cabin, their hands working together to plant seeds of hope for the spring to come. Evelyn found herself watching Jonas more closely, noticing the way he moved through the world with a new sense of belonging. He laughed more easily now, his voice softer when he spoke to the children, his touch gentle when he held Clara. The fear that had once haunted his eyes had faded, replaced by a quiet determination to build something lasting from the ashes of their old lives. One afternoon, as the sun warmed the porch and the children played nearby, a stranger appeared on the path leading from the woods. He was tall and thin, his clothes worn but clean, his eyes wary but kind. He carried a small pack and a battered hat, and when he reached the cabin, he paused, uncertainty flickering across his face. Jonas stepped forward, his hand resting lightly on the rifle propped against the wall. But Evelyn sensed no threat in the man's posture. The stranger introduced himself as Caleb, a traveler from the south, and asked if he might rest a while and share news from Red Willow. He spoke of changes in the town, a new sheriff, a sense of order returning, rumors of a school being built and families moving in. He had heard stories of a cabin in the hills where those in need might find shelter, and he wondered if he might stay, at least until the roads cleared. Evelyn glanced at Jonas, then at Ruth, and saw the same answer in their eyes. They welcomed Caleb, offering him a place by the fire and a bowl of stew. That night, as the wind rattled the eaves and the stars shone cold and bright above the clearing, the cabin felt fuller than ever, the boundaries of family stretching to include one more. The days that followed were marked by a gentle, persistent healing. Jonas and Caleb worked together to repair the barn, their laughter carrying across the yard as they traded stories and shared the weight of the work. Ruth and Evelyn planned for the coming months, making lists of supplies to trade for in town, dreaming of a larger garden, perhaps even a few chickens. Lila and Sam, emboldened by the presence of new friends, explored the woods and fields, their voices bright with the promise of adventure. Evelyn felt the change most keenly in the quiet moments when she rocked Clara to sleep by the fire, when she watched Jonas teaching Sam to aim a bow, when she saw Ruth and Caleb talking softly on the porch as dusk settled over the land. The wounds they had suffered, both visible and hidden, were healing, replaced by a sense of hope that grew stronger with each passing day. One evening, as the family gathered around the table, Evelyn found herself thinking of all the women she had met on the road, those who had lost husbands, homes, hope. She remembered the fear in their eyes, the way they clung to their children, the silence that followed them like a shadow. She realized, with a sudden clarity, that the safety and warmth they had found here was not something to be hoarded, but to be shared. That night, after the others had gone to bed, Evelyn sat by the fire and wrote a letter. She kept it simple, her words shaped by the memory of her own journey. If you are alone, if you are afraid, if you need a place to rest, come north. There is room here. There is hope. She gave the letter to Caleb, who promised to pass it along when he returned to town. Spring arrived slowly, the snow receding in patches, the earth softening beneath the children's feet. The garden sprouted green shoots, and the air filled with the scent of new grass and wildflowers. The cabin, once battered and broken, stood strong and welcoming, its walls echoing with laughter and the quiet hum of daily life. Evelyn watched her family grow not just in number, but in strength and spirit. She saw the way Jonas looked at her, the way Leela and Sam cared for their younger siblings, the way Ruth and Caleb found comfort in each other's company. She felt the weight of the past lifting, replaced by a sense of purpose that reached beyond the boundaries of their small clearing. As the days grew longer and the world warmed, travelers began to arrive, women with children, men seeking work, families searching for a new beginning. Each was welcomed. Each found a place by the fire, a share of the work, a measure of peace. The cabin became more than a home. It became a haven, a place where broken things could be mended, where hope could take root and grow. Evelyn Harper stood on the porch one evening, Clara in her arms, and watched the sun set over the hills. She listened to the sounds of her family, Jonas and Caleb laughing in the yard, Ruth singing softly to Eli, Lila and Sam chasing fireflies in the fading light. She felt the fullness of her life, the strength of the bonds they had forged, the promise of all that was still to come. In that moment, Evelyn understood that home was not a place, but a choice, a promise made and kept, day after day, in the face of hardship and loss. She knew there would be more storms, more trials, but she also knew they would face them together, their hearts bound by love, their lives shaped by the courage to begin again. Evelyn Harper stood at the edge of the clearing, the morning sun warming her face as she watched the valley below come alive with the colors of spring. The last traces of snow had melted, wildflowers bloomed, and the cabin, once battered, now stood strong and welcoming. Laughter and voices drifted from inside, mingling with bird song and the distant rush of the creek. The world had changed since that first winter, when fear and hunger pressed in on all sides. Now, the small community on the mountain had become more than a refuge. It was a home, a place where the lost and weary could find rest, where strangers became friends and friends became family. Evelyn felt it in every heartbeat, in the way Jonas's hand found hers, in the sound of the children's laughter as they chased each other through the tall grass. Jonas Blackwell had changed, too. The shadows that once haunted his eyes had faded, replaced by a quiet confidence and warmth. He moved through the days with purpose, his limp barely noticeable, his voice gentle, his laughter deep and easy. He had become a father in every way that mattered. And the children, Lila, Sam, Clara, and Eli, looked to him with trust and affection. The wedding was simple, held beneath the wide sky with the mountains as witness. Ruth and Caleb stood beside them. The children scattered wildflowers at their feet. There was no preacher, only the exchange of vows spoken softly, promises made and kept in the quiet strength of their joined hands. When Jonas slipped a silver ring onto Evelyn's finger, she felt the weight of the past lift, replaced by hope as solid as the land itself. Afterward, the community gathered for a feast, sharing bread, laughter, and stories. The table was crowded with new faces, travelers seeking shelter, women and children who had found their way north, men who had left behind old lives. Each brought something to share: a loaf of bread, a jar of preserves, a story, a song. The cabin rang with the sound of voices, the warmth of belonging. As the days grew longer and the world warmed, Evelyn and Jonas worked side by side to expand the cabin, adding new rooms, building a barn, planting rows of beans and corn. The children helped, their laughter bright as they learned to shape the world around them. Lila, now nearly a young woman, kept a journal of their days, her careful script capturing the details of their lives. The first calf born, the arrival of a new family, the way the light changed on the hills. One afternoon, as Evelyn hung laundry, a group of travelers appeared at the edge of the clearing. They were weary and dust-covered, but Evelyn saw in their eyes the same hope that had once brought her here. She called to Jonas, and together they welcomed the newcomers, offering water and bread, a place to rest, a promise of safety. The cabin, once a place of fear, had become a beacon for those in need. Jonas and Caleb built bunks in the loft, Ruth and Evelyn prepared extra meals, and the children showed the newcomers where to find wild berries and fresh water. Each new arrival brought a story, a skill, a memory of loss, but also a willingness to begin again. The community grew, not just in number, but in spirit, each person adding something unique to their shared life. In the evenings, they gathered around the fire, sharing stories and songs, laughter and tears. Lila read from her journal, her voice steady and clear, recounting the journey that had brought them all together. Her words became a thread that bound them, a record of hardship and hope, of the courage it took to start over, of the love that had grown in the most unlikely of places. Evelyn watched her children grow strong and sure, their faces open to the world, their hearts unafraid. She saw the way Jonas looked at her, the way his hand found hers in the quiet moments, the way he smiled at Clara as she toddled across the porch. She felt the fullness of her life, the richness of the bonds they had forged, the promise of all that was still to come. The land itself seemed to respond to their efforts, the fields yielding more each year, the orchard heavy with fruit, the garden bright with flowers. The cabin, once battered and broken, stood as a testament to what could be built from the ruins of the past. It was not just a shelter, but a home, a place where hope could take root and grow, where the wounds of old sorrows could heal, where the future was shaped by kindness and courage. As summer deepened, Evelyn often thought of the journey that had brought her here, the long road from Kansas, the nights spent in fear and uncertainty, the moment she had chosen to trust a stranger for the sake of her children. She remembered the pain of loss, the weight of grief, but also the moments of grace, the kindness of Ruth, the strength of Jonas, the laughter of her children, the warmth of the fire on a winter's night. She knew there would be more storms, more trials, but she also knew they would face them together, their hearts bound by love, their lives shaped by the courage to begin again. The West, for all its hardships, had given her a new beginning, a place to belong, a family to cherish. It had taught her that home was not a place, but a choice, a promise made and kept, day after day, in the face of hardship and loss. One evening, as the sun set behind the mountains and the sky blazed with color, Evelyn stood on the porch with Jonas at her side, Clara in her arms, and watched the children chase fireflies in the fading light. She listened to the sounds of laughter and music drifting from the cabin, the voices of friends and family mingling in the warm air. She felt the fullness of her life, the strength of the bonds they had forged, the promise of all that was still to come. Lila sat nearby, her journal open on her lap, her pen moving steadily across the page. She wrote of the journey that had brought them here, of the trials they had faced and the joys they had found, of the hope that had carried them through the darkest nights. Her words, Evelyn knew, would be a gift to those who came after a record of what it meant to build a home, to choose love over fear, to find family in the most unexpected places. As darkness fell and the stars appeared, Evelyn felt a deep peace settle over her. The world was still wild and uncertain, but within these walls, there was warmth and safety, laughter and love. The cabin on the mountain had become a haven, a place where the weary could rest, where the lost could be found, where hope could take root and flourish. In that quiet moment, surrounded by those she loved, Evelyn Harper understood at last the true meaning of home. It was not the walls or the roof, not the fields or the garden, but the people who filled it with life and laughter, with courage and kindness, with dreams and memories. It was the promise of a new beginning, the certainty that no matter what storms might come, they would face them together, their hearts bound by love, their lives shaped by hope,